All right, cool. It says I'm streaming, so I am going to. So I'm doing another office lecture today, which means that I do not have the benefit of my dual screens. So we are going to go through the slide deck and see how this one turns out. Cool. All right, so everything looks all right. So this is managing the transformational game pipeline. Now, this one is a little weird, and as far as lectures go for this course, this is a lecture. It kind of hinges on just kind of tales from the trenches about making these sorts of games. So that's what I guess kind of the feel of the lecture is going to be, is these sort of like, okay, I've talked a lot about this in somewhat theoretical seeming ways, but what's it like actually making this type of game? So that's what we're going to talk about today. So a lot of today is spent with really, again, my time making games like this. We're going to look a lot at a game project that I worked on called Function Force, especially how game industry knowledge, like broad entertainment game industry knowledge, plays into transformational game design. And here at Kent State, I am, I think, pretty safe to say, preaching to the choir in terms of like, should you engage with games? Should you play games? Things like that. Most of the students that I have in these courses are, if not outright gamers, but at least like game aware or game interested in such a way that can be like functionally viable in the practice of game making. But for a long time, I taught at schools where there might be some game skepticism or hesitancy. So whether that be a place where the student population was primarily from, we had folks coming from nonprofits and government institutions who had heard games were kind of a big deal in research as research tools, but and wanted to learn about that, but didn't want to become gamers, which again is like totally fine. That is I'm not trying to say this all as a gatekeeping way or in a gatekeeping way, but the really where the clarification had to happen was in guiding people towards understanding that just because you're learning about games doesn't mean you are having to become skilled with them or taking on something that some people might find socially not where they want to be. You're kind of like this is kind of a way to see how one builds a sense of familiarity with the game's medium while also being allowed to interact with it or not interact with it as works for them. Also, it's a good way to look at, how domain content, so like the thing from the field that we are helping apply the transformational game tools to, like what knowledge from the outside field gets balanced with like gameplay. So how do we balance those two things, especially when they collide and maybe don't quite get along? And then just general project management stories. And then other serious game studies, some other game projects I've been on, like when I was at George Mason University and things like that. And then how I've seen players interact and understand the meanings of these games. And then part of this is going to be boiled into, are visuals and sound important in transformational games? Because there is this kind of back and forth on how, well, we'll get to it. But actually, this is a thing that I'm doing a talk on as of this recording later this week. Now, if you're watching this like several years from now, I hope the talk went well. But check in with me on how that talk went. But as for right now, I am doing work on this currently. So this is a lot of this is about craft. Now, craft is this idea of, I'm going to bring this one up again. I'm going to beat this dead horse. But earlier in this semester, we talked about a scene from the game, the Stanley Parable, in which you, as the character in the Stanley Parable game, were going to put on a timer for myself. Oops. Nope, that's not the one I want. Go. All right. You, as the character in the Stanley Parable game, would arrive in a place where there was what the narrator in the game calls an art game. And the art game is one in which a cardboard cutout of a baby would move towards a very basic standard like particle effect fire, and there was a big red button, and like every time you clicked the big red button, the baby would be farther away from the fire. And apart from the assets of the fire and the baby and the button, everything was this sort of like standard gray box. Looked very similar to like if you were using the source engine to the Hammer editor to build your level kind of setup. And the kind of absurdity of this game, both in the very ham-fisted representation of what it purported to be about, which was sort of like the drudgery of adult life or something like that, and responsibility, but also the fact that the mechanics were ham-fisted, but alongside that you had a voice kind of droning on about what the deeper philosophy and meaning of this project were. And that's not delivered through gameplay, it's delivered through somebody talking at you while you play the game. Now, we've talked a lot about what it means when, those games, how effective is that game as, again, the Stanley Parable scene is a joke, but it's also a joke, frankly, born of stuff that really happens, real games that, like, I've even judged for competitions. I usually reject these games. The reason I usually reject these games is that they require the person to be standing next to you explaining the thing. They don't impart this meaning on their own, and thus are kind of ineffective as games. They're like, there's a academic paper alongside this game, and in being that, the game part is kind of undercooked, despite its using fire. Because in my thought, meaning and entertainment should really work together as seamlessly as possible to create transformational games. That's why I don't like the term serious game, because I think serious games are games that apologize for being games. I don't think we should be doing that. I think we should utilize all of the things in our toolbox as game developers and as creators of meaningful, engaging experiences, whether or not that experience uses the emotion or the experience of fun, as you normally think of when you make a like purely commercial entertainment game. But the ways in which we learn to elicit fun or other emotional experiences in our game products matter. They really matter. And understanding how games work, how games do that, how successful games do that matters, as opposed to, again, just like slapping some interactivity on something and calling ourselves, ooh, I'm so cutting edge. We want to be, I think, more earnest about this, and not kind of create like cynical. I guess all of this. I'll tell you this. All of this comes from, I would say, I've seen experiences in transformational games, and frankly, it's made me kind of cynical in a way about them as well. But I've seen instances in the subfield of transformational games where people that don't really value the game's medium want to use the game's medium, but not in like a positive way. they kind of see that there might be money to be made in utilizing the games medium because people get excited about them who love games, um, and they hop on board the hype train, and that's not really what I see as sustainable. Like, that's fine if you want to be a trend chaser, but in terms of actually creating something that can become a way for folks to make a sustainable living, this is something that we should really look at. How do we integrate this understanding of making good gameplay more meaningfully with um, this subfield of transformational or serious games? So here's a game that I worked on that we're going to talk a lot about today, which is Function Force. Now, this is one of the first screenshots. I guess it's a screenshot of a YouTube video of Function Force, but some colleagues and I from where I used to work at the American University Game Lab, now the Game Center, and from also folks in the industry, created this during the White House Educational Game Jam. You heard that right. The White House, the Obama White House, had a bunch of game developers to Washington, D.C. to game jam for the Obama administration. Through the Department of Education. It was education, right? And the Office of Science and Technology Policy, when one of the folks there was Mark DeLaura, who is a long time industry veteran, who also worked at Nintendo. He's kind of like the person that we have to thank for having Ocarina of Time in the US, because he was able to get it onto a cartridge. But he later worked at Office of Science and Technology Policy and had a game jam. It wasn't in the White House. The presentation was in the executive office building, which is next to the White House, still in the White House complex. But we game jammed in an office in downtown DC. It was really cool though. So here's a picture of the White House Game Jam final presentations. And there's Mark on the right. And there is the workspace that we worked at in this company that was at in the DuPont Circle area of Washington, D.C. So this was their office that they had for the White House Game Jam. And here's a poster that my colleagues and I made for a game. This kind of had a concept screenshot of what we eventually wanted to turn the game into, so the game we made was called Function Force. It was a shoot 'em up game, like an old school style shoot 'em up, where you used math graphing functions to change the shape of a laser. So your laser was the graph, the math function graph, and you would shoot cyborg dinosaurs, because it's a shoot 'em up and we need a cool enemy. So you'd shoot cyborg dinosaurs with your graph, and you'd basically change the equation and use different kind of functions. In the times when you thought okay, I need to get around this raptor's shield. I can't use a linear function. I need to use a parabolic function to have the laser kind of parabola down and under the shield so that it hits the enemy and blows them up. So that was the idea that we had in the game jam that we executed. If you saw, gonna go back. Yeah, see, there's the version that we made at the game jam, but we were going to kind of expand it out into this more kind of pixel art, retro-looking version. And again, we had some cool cyborg dinosaurs. So here's the version that we finally ended up with. Now, this version was something that we had hoped to make as a kind of commercial game. But what happened is, along the way, we were working with a client on some as part of the university we were at. We were working with a client on some assessment games, some like student assessment games. This was like for an educational company, and the I was the artist kind of between two teams. And one team, I would say, was really like they were game developers in the industry. They were folks who had some success like in the indie game space. They actually had an IGF uh, nominated game when they were in school. So they'd done some really awesome things, like but were really skilled game developers. And then another team were people that I would say were less interested in the game aspect of it, thought of interactivity broadly as a tool for learning, but weren't really as games literate. Um, and these two approaches, like they were very the approaches were very different. Um, you know, one team, the game industry more veteran team, I would say really wanted to. They were focused more on like, let's create these sort of they knew what engaged, basically. They knew what players were engaged by and tried to employ that into creating what they were making. So they had like some a game. Their primary project was creating this like sort of social, like learning from a game about learning from other cultures, and they kind of turned it into this like neat fantasy visual novel sort of thing that played with a social simulation system, which was really fascinating. But it was in this like wrapper of a cool video game, whereas um, you know the other team had a lot of problems coming up with something that would like really engage audiences, and that the audiences the um, that the client was working with, like they didn't quite click with their games very well, and it was really kind of tough. So me and some of the folks from like the more industry focused team were staying around, chatting during one of our meetings. We like every 6 months we'd like in person meet with the client to discuss like the strategy for the next phase of the project. So, in this like project to make several different types of games. So, we're sitting around chatting, me and the game industry uh, uh, more veteran focused group. And the guy from the client, one of the project managers from the client side comes up. Now there were two managers. One was, there was the manager for the you know the team that wasn't performing as hot. They were focused on a thing called like, they were micro games. They were trying to make like lots of little experiences versus like the kind of bigger, more RPG looking system. So the guy who was overseeing the microgame project comes up to us and said, "Hey, how's it going? What are you all working on these days, like outside of all this?" And we started talking about like, wow, we were working on our function force game, and here we had like come up with this artwork, and here's the basic idea, and yada yada yada. So he says, "Oh, that's really cool. Could you make a version for us?" Like, but instead of doing it as a sort of like teaching game, maybe it's a testing tool. Maybe it's like a way to test students' abilities with these skills as a assessment tool rather than as the teaching tool. And we were like, cool, that sounds great. And he's like, I don't have a lot of money I could give you, but I have like about 20K. So and if you've never worked with game development budgets before, 20K is not really a lot of money. It is a lot of money, but it's not a lot of money to make a video game. If you take into account like if you're going to work on a video game for a year and your team each has to be able to pay their rent and mortgage and food and bills and all that other stuff, it is not like a bunch of people's yearly salary, right? So think in those terms. So we're like, oh, okay, cool, because 20K, that'll get you like some student help for a semester and maybe some pieces of equipment, depending on how you budget it. But that can be really useful. So we put together, we got a small student team together and came up with this idea that was like an assessment version of function force. So this is what we had as our prototype. But you can see what we did was, we worked with the client to really hammer down how the game would flow. And that was one of the things that we were really worried about was, okay, if it's an assessment game, so its focus is less on the teaching, but more on the testing. And this is one area where it really got tough with the client, not like tough, but like, where we had a few moments of like head scratching, because on one hand, yeah, you could have the the game take advantage, and here you see like a super negative score because we weren't doing that well in that like playthrough. But you see, for example, instances where, because it's assessment, the student had to get to the assessment. Well, the client was like, well, you can't really die in this game because like if you're dying, then that's going to take you out of the game, and then they lose the assessment, right? So that was kind of a thing where we're like, well, we're making a shoot 'em up, but a shoot 'em up we can't really die. That's not our ship can't be in danger. That's not really a shoot 'em up. It's kind of like what we wanted to avoid making was a test that looked like a shoot 'em up, but was really only a test. But we had to be sensitive to certain things like how do we teach the player to operate the game software, not even to like let's say the game doesn't have to teach them function graphs. That's like something you do in the classroom. Fine, great. But how do we teach the student to operate the game so that if the assessment part of the game is how long does it take to solve, to be able to like put the right coefficient into the equation, how how do we know that what they're, if they take a long time to do it, how do we know that it's the student is not fumbling the controls rather than not knowing the answer? So how do we like make sure that we teach the game while also maybe not keep the focus on teaching the concept? And then frankly, how do we make the game interesting? Because like the thing about a lot of learning games is if they are a test disguised as a shoot 'em up, but like the shoot 'em up doesn't really have shoot 'em up action, um, the students are going to kind of smell BS real quick. So how do we make it so that like the game is cool, but also something that will, you know, um, something that will correspond to the client needs, because they're paying us. They're paying us to make the thing that they wanted. So we came up with this series of, we came up with a compromise design where we'd have these sessions of gameplay. And that gameplay was like there were enemies, the enemies would charge at you, and you'd have to use your laser to shoot them like in a shoot 'em up. Now, these sections were not taking data. What they were doing, so they weren't doing the analytic part. What they were doing is they do something like this, where you'd be flying. You'd press the buttons and learn how to fly, and then you'd see something like this, where it forces you to get one of these icons. The icons were, we only focused on linear functions for this first go around, but basically what would happen is that this would make the coefficient to x go up or down. And then by playing the game and shooting the laser and seeing how the coefficient would go up or down, you would then, again, go back to this screen, you would then see, okay, I will then like use these pickups to adjust my laser so that I can face the next oncoming challenge or wave of enemies. So that was like the gameplay part, but it also taught you how to actually operate the ship. And the first one, again, you can't avoid it, but then once you realize what these things do, because you can see how it affects the equation at the bottom, and you can see how it affects your laser, you start to see how that is actually part of the gameplay, and you learn to look for those icons. Then you get to a screen like this, where your ship stops. You have ever recharging versions of the icons, the pickups, and it'll start. This is when it starts to measure how long does it take for you to figure out, um, which coefficient to use. So basically, the player can pick up the pickup icons so that they can hit this switch that will open the door. That's a small puzzle section. It doesn't scroll or anything. It's just there to make the player stop and think about the actual system, and that's when the game is actually taking data. So you have these alternating sequences of gameplay, but gameplay that's meant to teach the systems of how to operate the ship. We're not teaching the coefficient thing. That's what the classroom does. We're teaching mainly gameplay, but we're using that as an opportunity to play a video game. And then periodically your gameplay is interrupted by this essentially test. This is a math test now, but it's a math test that feels more like a puzzle screen within the broader context of a video game. And in doing that, it doesn't seem so much like you're just, I've talked previously about you're doing it wrong if you're making a game like this and you put like a quiz in the middle. I'm thinking about the old Bible Adventures game on the Nintendo Entertainment System, like that. You would have these action stages where like you could be Noah and you'd be like deadlifting animals into the ark. And that would be your like engagement with the story of Noah and the ark, but then you'd like the gameplay would stop and then give you a multiple choice quiz. That's not what we're doing. We're trying to make that quiz part, the part that engages the actual testing features. We're trying to make that feel like gameplay that's organic with what you were just doing while you were playing the video game. So, what are some of the challenges and the lessons learned from this? Well, so what we learned. So we later found out that money came from that we gotten came from the group that they were not as happy with. And the lesson there, frankly, is that, what got us that money was the pitch of, one, this game is really cool, but two, it had the elements that people like in video games. It was a cool novelty. Holy cow, a shoot 'em up where you can change your laser with math by like adjusting an equation. I have talked to people in the industry about this game so many times in the year since, because one of the agreements that we struck with the client was like, hey, but if we make this prototype, could we take what we've made and then maybe turn it into a further commercial version? They were totally fine with that. We haven't actually sat down and done it. I really still want to. And it's one of those things where every time I mention this game to people, they're like, oh man, that sounds amazing. Even if they're not like super into math, they're like, that sounds so cool. So that's one of the things, is like it had a novelty, it had cool gameplay, it's a genre people are familiar with. We understand what made games cool and fun. And again, I said I wasn't going to use fun, but like in this case, it was like, let's try to make something really cool and fun. And that other team didn't get it. They were trying to make the equivalent of the art game where somebody recites their research paper at you, and it just sort of like they weren't interesting. And we took their money. So knowing what makes commercial games engaging is really important. And I know I'm speaking to the choir here, but I cannot tell you how many times I have met students, other designers in this, and it's not everybody. It's not everybody, because I will go to conferences and I will kind of bang this drum and game developers that are friends of mine will be like, yeah, Chris, we know, duh. But it really was kind of like the scene where I was. I mean, I used to work for a place where they told us we weren't allowed to say video game. This is a different place, because, the people walking through would think that it was juvenile. Um, you know, don't apologize for this medium, and don't let people apologize for this medium. Again, I've worked with people where I've had to convince them, look, I don't expect you to be streaming on Twitch and 100% every game you're playing. You could never play a video game, but at least know why people like them. And learn enough about ones that seem popular and successful. Go watch a let's play for 10 minutes and you'll probably be fine. But knowing what makes this medium, apart from some vague notion of interactivity, is really important, because it is more complicated than you have a reward system on it. There's going to be a lecture later in the semester where I just take the concept of gamification and just roast it, because it's game design implemented badly. But if you don't understand games, that's kind of the easiest, most surface level version of what people think is good about games, and it's not. It's so much more complex than that, and nuanced and wonderful. But you need to know that, even if you don't become a huge gamer yourself. So play lots of games, but you don't have to be an expert at them. You can just play them, sample them, or again, like I said, watch a let's play. If certain games feel inaccessible to you, it's still time well spent learning about. And this is the argument I always used to make to my students that were coming to us from non-gaming backgrounds. You have decided to make games part of your professional life. You need to know about them to be better at your professional life. Again, I'm kind of preaching to the choir here at Kent State, but these are important lessons because they tell you how understanding why games are engaging helps you make games. Pushing back for your game is important. We did not really feel great about a quiz that was interactive, which was kind of what the client was angling for in that way. So, one, you have to listen to your client, because we couldn't do something like the levels that would teach you how to use these functions. That wasn't what the client wanted. So we had to get to the assessment as fast as possible. But we also acknowledged the need to have the student learn the base operation of the game so that when they played it, their grade on the assessment wasn't skewed the wrong way because they were taking too long to actually fiddle around with the controls. And if the first time they had ever seen these pickups for the plus and minus to change the coefficient, they probably would perform less well because it'd be the first time they were seeing those things. By having training levels beforehand that we had to fight to get to into the game, that allowed people to be experts with the operation of the game by the time that they actually reached anything that would assess you. Same thing with waves of enemies. The game lets you fight enemies. You can blow up when you hit the enemies. That is just gameplay time. But finding a compromise, like pushing back so that you can compromise and find something that's mutually agreeable, both from a gameplay perspective and from assessment or whatever your game is about, that can be very important. So don't be afraid to push back on that, because you are still game developers. You're not just people making a website. That's what I always go to when people want to just add interactivity to it. It's like, make a website. Sorry, you don't need game developers for that. Remember, content area experts, listen to them. They are your experts in their content area, but they're not game designers. So it's your job to kind of guide them in a direction of helping them. They want a game for their thing because games are engaging and they like that. they like the idea that their content will be engaged with happily. But if they don't understand games, then it's not their job to. It's your job to. The people that I talk about when I say you need to learn about games, that's the game makers. And there are people that, like I said, they want to become game makers and not learn how to engage games, and that's not entirely right. But the client's job, the content area expert's job, their job is not to make games. So they either might have like a ton of ideas because holy cow, like anybody else, they'll be like, oh man, I could give suggestions to game developers. So you might get the occasional email where it's like, oh, wouldn't it be cool if this happened? Kindly explain like what is or is not within scope. That's the thing you have to do. But also on the flip side, it's your job to push for those engaging elements so that you don't just end up with gamification, which is like do thing, get a cookie, get some points, get a reward, whatever, level up. But it's only like a level up system, no other things. Or they might want it to be like kind of take all the suspense and engagement, the thing that gets you to kind of say, no, just one more play, out of the game. And that's self-defeating because, they want the engagement. You need to help them understand what all it is that makes games engaging. So so one of the things we learned in this was to find out ways to have the purely serious parts. So that's this screen, which is the testing part, the assessment part, the part where the assessment tools were kicked on. But it's also okay to have purely playful parts. And this was actually something that did come up in our prep. It came up in our paper writing where I remember writing the level design section, and somebody from the client side was like, what is this section? It's not about teaching and assessment. It's like, no, but it is about how level design contributes to training and education. And it may not be all about teaching and assessment, but it does support the topic of the paper. And it was left in, and the paper was accepted at a very big conference. So, the game design, is important. The game, I don't want to say gaminess. That's like why, food that your like uncle caught tastes funny. Like the sort of game-ish playful elements are really important because that's what actually people want. That's what people want when they want to say like games engage audiences. So here are two other games that we made. This was years before Function Force. So this was called Life Quest and Onward. So these are actually two games on the same topic. There are two games about, helping people stay out of prison once they have completed their sentence. So this is like helping people through their parole process. So part of an analysis in game making like this is understanding the right game medium to use. So we've talked about this. So if you're going to make a game for a client, think about this. What is the interaction time? How often is the person playing the game, and how long are they going to play? Do you want the game to be social or not? So is it played individually or is it played with a group of people? How long does onboarding take? Now, onboarding is the process of getting people trained such that they understand how to use a piece of software or a tool. So how long does it take to learn how to operate the game? Like we were talking about with Function Force, is the person going to miss questions because we didn't onboard them or because they don't understand the math content? We needed to like have something so that we knew that they were onboarded right. And we use that as a means to make fun shoot 'em up video gameplay. So the onboarding here was a big thing because like, well, if this is designed to help people, is the onboarding really, how do we work? How do we make it work so that they can, make this a part of what helps them in their lives as quick as possible. And then also, who are your players? So this is one where, and you've heard me say this before, the client or subject matter experts were the writers. So for this, this was a system where we almost actually did use gamification here. We had other things going on that I'll talk about. So gamification, again, we're going to have a whole lecture on this, but again, it's the application of usually only reward systems to reward something in the real world. So, gamification could include you get points at the grocery store for shopping there often. That's an older idea than gamification, but like websites and portals can really gamify that experience. Xbox achievements are gamification. They are achievements. They're like extra points you get for like doing other things in games besides just playing the base game. Like the game is suddenly not its own fulfillment. You're also fulfilled by like the points you get in the Xbox operating system. Or PlayStation trophies or things like that. Or sites like Super Better by Jane McGonigal, which is a website where you log in like positive activities you take during the day, and then those positive activities become points which level you up into and give you rankings and stuff like that. Or Duolingo, which is that has gamification and how like practice your Japanese for the day and get points, right? So that's gamification, is where it's like kind of just the point system of a video game. So I slam gamification a lot, but the base gameplay of these two games was a lot of gamification. It was like add things to your game, or this day you have these challenges, and if you complete these challenges, you will get points. Now, where it changed from gamification, which is only the use of those kind of like point systems and rankings, is that it kind of fed back into the fantasy of the game, which was, so for example, on Life Quest, that was the more gamified one, but that was very much one where you would, as you go through the game, you build up the ability to customize and have agency over like your character's identity a bit. What that did was, it let you have that like fun fantasy element of a character creator. Likewise with Onward, you had customization options, but in addition to that, on top of like the base point gathering through doing things like preparing a resume and stuff like that, you had like this little mini Metroidvania to play. And by spending your points in the shop, you would also unlock this like video game. So there was kind of it was gamified for part, but then it was like, which was the analysis of like, frankly, what the client wanted and what they thought was what would help them. But these other elements made it more than that and allowed it to be more of like a video game experience, because it engaged that fun fantasy experience that keeps people coming back for video games and keeps them engaging. And again, this was all based around like a kind of quick check-in app, because that's what engagement it was designed for. But everything for those quests, for what we could and couldn't have the players do, was checked through the subject matter experts. So the subject matter experts were kind of our writers that said, no, you can't have them do this because this raises this kind of issue, or you need to have this in there because this is important and they need to hear this, or they need to experience that. So engaging with the client in a meaningful way was really nice. Whereas for Function Force, there was a lot of compromising because we came from like two competing ideas: teaching versus assessment, losable equals fun versus losable equals break the assessment, and having to find those like compromises. This one was more like, okay, in this way, it was much more of the like the writing helped keep the game grounded. That external engagement, and that's not to say clients are kind of hit or miss. The client for Function Force was amazing. They were amazing people to work with, but that's an instance where the game goals were not so easily aligned, and we really had to navigate that much more than this one, where it was like really aligned. Like it made sense from the beginning. We had to like break our brain and put it back together again to understand how to make a game out of it. But we still had to work with them, kind of like guiding our hand in terms of like what we could or couldn't do. The last game I want to look at is a game called Delivery Drone. And this one was really interesting because so this game was meant to be a news game, meaning a game that responds to some event in a real news story. So the news in question was this was a story that was going to be put out by a well-known newspaper about like the risks and dangers or worries about delivery drones, like delivering your packages from things like Amazon and stuff like that. And this was like in 2014 or 15. So the idea of the game was that like the pitch is that like, oh, we need to get this out by next week because like, that's when the news story is going out. So the first one is set realistic development goals. We didn't hit this deadline, but we made an engaging game. The problem is that they wanted a game put out entirely too fast, with no warning. And I realize it's funny because I have warning in big yellow letters here. So there was the goals of the project did not quite align with what the project was like what the client was asking for. So we kind of had to like duck out from really making the game. Plus I remember they were not even really that clear about what kind of drones they were about. It was like the dangers of drones. So then we put together this prototype that was like about military drones. And then we showed it to them and they were like, oh, we meant UPS drones or like Amazon drones. And we were like, oh, you did not tell us that at all. So we had to kind of duck out. So sometimes you're given bad information from clients. So make sure that you question the client on what exactly it is that they are looking for. But regardless, all of that was still very unrealistic, and we didn't end up making it for the news story. That's fine. There is a thing for news games, and that is a valuable area of game development and integration with news. Just you really need a dedicated, like, this is a group of people whose day job is this. This was a group of faculty members who were kind of like, hey, can we do this? Maybe. Among your other things, it was not great. So it wasn't really realistic for us. So, great part of the field, but it's got to be by people like whose day job it is. And they can like spend a week crunching on this. So again, I generally tell people like journalism games, great field, but not really viable for a studio unless, you are a dedicated studio to that. So, or unless like the project is bigger and takes a long time. So if it's going to be kind of not an event driven, like we're doing this report and the reporting on it, is going to come out in 6 months. Could you make an interactive piece for that? Great. That's awesome. Because it's like you have more time. Unless you're in those situations where the deadline is a little farther out, or you're a dedicated studio who this is your thing, you do it week-long turnarounds of little news games. It can be really tough to make these. So watch out for journalism games, but they're neat. They're neat. There's a great book out on them by some friends of mine. So, but this game brought up this idea of like games. What if games as political cartoons? So we still made the game because we were like, well, there's a good core here. We should take this delivery drone idea and like maybe sort of play with it and bend it and see like, does this have legs as a game? Because it was fun. It was a fun game. Um, so we played with it, made it, made this kind of arcade experience where you were a drone and you'd have to go to the box depot and pick up the delivery drone, the delivery packages, and then you'd have to try to fly over houses that wanted packages while you were carrying a package, but avoid houses where they didn't want packages. And you knew what they were because we color coded them: red roofs for no, blue roofs for yes. And also, like, the one where they didn't want you looking was there were like people in their backyard pool. So it was like kind of like, oh no, you're taking pictures of me in my pool. So it kind of made it feel like icky to have a drone flying overhead that has cameras and stuff. So that's what the game was. It was this like game where you had to avoid other drones and avoid going over these other houses. And if you didn't, you would either blow up because you'd be hit by the other drones, or you'd be decommissioned because you went over too many houses that wanted privacy. So it was this kind of like arcade experience. Now, this was a fun project because when we put it out, some players thought we were pro drone. When we went to go show it at festivals, some players thought we were pro drone. Others thought that we were anti drone. We really just wanted to make like a snarky game about this like kind of absurd thing. But reading the reaction from audiences was really fascinating and informative because it showed how, and again, I like even seeing within a few minutes of each other, people saying, "Oh man, you must love drones," and "Oh man, you think drones are terrible." It was interesting seeing how that turned into a conversation about the role of like drones in this kind of thing. So then the last thing I want to talk about is, so you'll hear these arguments sometimes, because I know, especially since most of you are starting your game projects now, there comes a point where you start to say, well, I want to make a game about this kind of character, and they're going to be my character in my serious game. Now, something to think about is that lessons in games you'll hear this argument: lessons in games are genuinely more successful if the art matches what is being trained. What this is saying, so this is from a paper called Testing the Power of Game Lessons, the Effects of Art Narrative on Reducing Cognitive Bias. So this paper says don't use fantastic elements at all, just depict what you're trying to teach. Now this is based on a study, but the study in the paper shows that detailed art distracts from lessons and is harder to interpret. But I actually have a few issues with this. Now I'm bringing up this not to like smack down this paper, but I'm bring this up because having made lots of these types of games, there was a period in general where the question was, does art actually have a place in this? Do you need really good art at all, or can you just kind of have like whatever? And it came down to like production realities and money and stuff like that. So do you need to pay artists? So this is actually what a lot of my work has been about, was, when you are making these sorts of games, how can art become part of what I call like the game's critical network of meaning? Can game art contribute? Now, this depends largely on whether or not you see game art as assets within the, if you see art assets within the game as artworks themselves, or if they could just contribute to the game. And I think in serious games, in game understanding in general, mostly because I've been beating this drum very hard and people are finally starting to listen. But you start to see this thing where it used to be where when we had a game, people would be like, oh, here, I'll just use my Game Boy mug. I don't feel like getting my copy of La Mancha is over there, but I don't feel like taking up my whole thing. So people would be like, ooh, the game. the game is just this like object game, right? And so they would just be like, world hunger, game, wave the game at the world hunger, and then the world hunger will go away. That was kind of how I feel like a lot of folks engaged with serious games, was that games were this sort of singularity, and that was it. The interactivity was the point, and this is where you get that like website thing, like, oh, we're going to make some mechanics that on their surface represent the drudgery of human existence, and it's going to be, everybody's going to think we're real smart, and then we're going to wave our game at it, and then people are going to think we're impressive. But anybody who has made a game, anybody that plays games, a lot of fans know that individual game assets, like Epic Mickey here from the game Epic Mickey, like, this is Mickey Mouse. This is a nice model of Mickey Mouse. It has aesthetic qualities that I find pleasing and why I keep him on my desk. Somebody worked real hard on this picture, on this model of Mickey Mouse, right? And Mind Style is the group that made this, copy of Mickey Mouse here. Now, game assets are works of art. They are works that I have also on my desk, like pictures behind my screen of the game Monument Valley that I'm not going to drag out because, I do have these though, kudzu sprites made out of perler beads. This was the thought, this was the creation of the result of lots and lots of distinct artistic choices. So the point being is that, sorry for anybody who has to like look closely at my mouth and neck while I do that in the camera. The point being that I'm making here is that in serious games, there is a ongoing head scratching, can't even call it a debate, it's more of a head scratching about the role of whether or not art assets matter for serious game creation. Now, you have papers like this one that I've pointed out. It's available in your syllabus if you want to read it, but they say don't have fantasy or some kind of fiction or, really like game art as we normally think about it as game art, right? And I disagree with that. Now, I think there are areas where it does behoove us to have, like, are you training nurses to operate a piece of machinery? Should probably realistically depict the patient and the nurse and the room and the piece of machinery, right? Those kind of training situations, you do need one-to-one because you're training on something. And those sorts of extra serious training focused things should be done one-to-one because they are more about like this kind of one-to-one thing. But other games, it's okay to put in some fantasy. It's okay to put in something because, if your game is for kids, if your game, that's kind of the easy one, but it's like, if your game is for kids, that is going to be an engaging way to teach them how the thing works, is if it's a fantasy. Now, again, the Oregon Trail was one-to-one, but at that point you're teaching like about settlers and kind of this like version of America, right? There's like a, whether or not you agree with that kind of depiction of like Manifest Destiny and all the very problematic parts of our history, you still get this idea where it's been kind of mythologized, right? So it has a mythology to it. So that generally applies to training games. Appealing characters and settings are a plus for educational games. So that can help if you're working with kids, especially if you're making games for kids. But sometimes, like, again, with the case of Life Quest and Onward, that was just like the game is for people who've been through like really bad things in their life. Give them some feeling like they're some sort of epic hero, right? And that's what we determined was good for that audience. So, when you hear about these things, like, does art matter? Yes. Because the art can become part of the critical network of the game. And if you want more about that, read my Nemo paper. But truthfully, if you look at the paper that that has issues, by the way, I'm referring to is this cognitive bias one. So like if you read it, I think it's an interesting thing to think about. I think the paper has issues, only testing for how art affects cognitive bias, but it makes a leap to all serious games, which I think is problematic. This is a way of telling you that, fantasy, one, do art assets matter? Yes. Two, does fantasy matter, and should you use it? Yes, as long as the case is right. And as you can see, I'm a person that very much uses fantasy and engaging art in his serious games, and they become like kind of it's that thing where that's part of what people like about games. They like the fantasy. They like being able to put themselves in somebody else's shoes and enjoy this idea of like testing the waters of this other identity. And then also the other problem with this paper is that they say detailed art meaning realism. And they're saying that like if the art is too realistic, you spend more time looking at the art than you do thinking about what the game is teaching you. I don't agree with that. Games made well in general, and that's what this lecture is about. If you are good at the craft of game making, and you understand what people find engaging about games, you will be able to sell your ideas better. You will be more successful than people who decide that game making, the making good games is secondary to kind of like cashing in on serious games being hot. And serious games are not as hot as they used to be. So, these people's cash cow is not what it once was. And that's good for people who know how to make sustainably good games long term, not just, again, ride the hype train. So you will be able to win contracts if you can balance these skills of making good games and making good games that mean things. So the next thing I want to see is to make your first prototype and finish your design document. So first prototyping your game should include a base core mechanic and playable in such a way that playtesters can think about the educational or transformational content. Maybe it's in text in your game. It doesn't need to be polished or even look nice, but it needs to be playable in some base form. In this particular semester where I'm recording this, a lot of students are making twines of their games that might not become twines, but the twine game engine is a very good tool for first prototypes. Kind of walks you through stuff, but it also has a lot of text based tools in it which will help you engage the meaningful content in a nice way. So that's what folks at this time of this recording are using. And then also make sure you make a page for your game on the website itch.io. You can make a private page if you don't want to share it yet, but share the link with me so I can access the game and try it out. So that's it. All right. I will talk to you later.